just for quick framing remarks, 27 out of Africa's 30 largest economies have been growing at an extraordinary clip. A good deal of wealth has been created. Some poverty has been alleviated, but that growth is not broad-based. It is only affecting a few, and therefore the kind of development that's happening that's very rapid is not inclusive, and so, or sufficiently inclusive. And so many of the newly wealthy have come together to talk about perhaps taking on philanthropy, actually combining three opportunities they have to try to right that wrong. One is to make grants. The second is to invest in small and growing African companies that create jobs and opportunities for others. And the third is to use their voice to speak out for those who maybe lack a voice, lack that kind of access to opportunity. They will be following in the footsteps of those who've come before them, and one of the most remarkable among them is Mo Ibrahim, originally of Sudan, who began the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. And among his very smart choices in life, Mo named his daughter Hadil to lead the foundation that carries his name. And as you will soon see, Hadil is a very powerful leader in her own right. And you know, if you are a representative of the next generation, then we're all in good shape looking forward, I must say. The focus of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation is on governance. And you know, whenever there's a conversation about governance, no matter what continent you're on, the question is always, why aren't there more Nelson Mandelas? Why aren't there more Nelson Mandelas in Asia, in the Americas, in Africa, and in all points in between? And Moipone is leading a foundation that was started by Nelson Mandela. But let me just say, I think a question that's in all of us, and particularly yesterday when we heard from Graça, is the question of, does it take a Nelson Mandela? Does it take a Graça Machel? Does it take an individual's character to change the character of a political system and the character of a social system? Or does it take us all? And do we need to tap the Graça or the Madiba within each of us to achieve that kind of future? And Moipone is betting on that. Her full name is Moipone Buddha Ramatho. She has been the leader of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. And again, she is a tremendous leader herself. I'm going to open, Hadil, with you and just say, most of us know about the Mo Ibrahim Award. Mm-hmm. And you know, as we talk about sort of redefining Africa or redefining the African woman, tell me, as you think about that award and as your father and you thought this through, what was your hope in terms of the story it would tell of Africa?
But thank you very much. Maybe just to give some context about the award, the the Ibrahim Prize for Achievement in Leadership is a $5 million award offered annually to a retired African head of state or government, depending if he's the executive. And it's for a head of state or government who's come constitutionally, done the right thing, and left after the constitutionally mandated 1 or 2 or 3 terms. So that's kind of the overview. I think there were several things that we were trying to do. One was to say to heads of state that if they did the right thing, they would be looked after they left office. You know, in Africa, some countries don't have pensions for former heads of state. We don't have yet the opportunities that former heads of state like President Clinton or Tony Blair have to go into the private sector and make millions of dollars a year. So we were concerned about the incentives that were being created for heads of state to secure their future while they were in office and in effect to sort of feather their nest while they were in office. So that was one thing that we sought to do. Another thing was that we felt that most heads of state, there had been some wonderful heads of state on the continent, but they really weren't known because we were falling victim to the perception-reality gap in Africa, and bad news is more interesting news than good news. So the media reports much more on Mugabe's than it does on Chisano's. So it was a real effort to engage young Africans around exemplars. you know, I think one of the challenges of working with youth in Africa is understanding the extent to which young Africans have started to internalize all the bad things that they've read about themselves and they've been told about themselves, and we think of ourselves as fundamentally more corrupt or fundamentally less disposed towards good behavior. And I think that's a nature of media reporting in some part. So I think we were very keen to hold up exemplars and say, you know, we have got our Shosanos or our Perezes or our Mochais who maybe before the prize no one had actually heard of.
And perhaps in the not too distant future, we may hear a woman's name in that same conversation.
Absolutely. We hope so.
We hope so. And the trick to getting there is electing more women. But tell me something, you know, as you think about this, you know, if you did a pure cost-benefit analysis, you could make more than $5 million by being corrupt. So there is something within each of these individuals. So I wanted to first, Tadil, ask you, what are the characteristics you see that they share? And then turn to you, Moipano, and ask whether that kind of, those leadership qualities can be taught. But first, what do they share?
I would say that the core attribute that they share is a notion of leadership as service and as stewardship, and really understanding that they're in power in order to hand over something better to the next generation. It's not leadership as ownership of the state, but as a kind of custodianship of the state. And I would say they're all people hugely invested in ensuring that the next generation inherits something that has really moved on from when they came to power. And I would say looking around the world, you know, that isn't necessarily even true always in the US or in Europe. I mean, I think in the US now you have a generation whose material wealth will be less than that of their parents in real terms. You know, I think the same is true in Europe, where almost certainly people are going to live less prosperous lives than their parents did, because their parents' generation absolutely failed them in terms of governance, in terms of public policy making. So I think, you know, it's a very specific notion of leadership that's not specific to Africa or anywhere else. You know, it's a notion of service rather than ownership that they share.
And say something about whether that sense of service and that sense of community and commitment to community is something that can be taught.
Yes, I think so. When you look at, you know, the leaders that we're talking about, and the kinds of backgrounds that they came from, most of the leadership was about the people, you know, about passion, about caring. And this is what we see in the leaders that are now, unfortunately, you know, dying, leaving Africa. And we, unfortunately, also are seeing more negative behavior that is also being learned, you know, by our young people. But I really believe that leadership can be taught, and it can be, you know, you can train somebody to be a good leader. And what do we mean by training, by teaching? We mean exposing to the right environment, exposing to the right behavior, exposing, you know, giving people information that is useful, giving people information that shows that life can be different. But the exposure that we're seeing now is that it's easy to make $5 million overnight. And you don't have to do the right things to have the money that you need. And for me, it's unfortunately exposing our young people to what will in future kill our societies. Because as you can see, like we have heard now, we're seeing in countries like, you know, in Europe, where previous generations have not done the right thing, and now the countries are now, you know, beginning to collapse. We've seen in Africa where failed states have really failed their children, and I believe that if you don't, you know, serve your people as a leader, you are really killing your nation, because frankly, if you do not train or do the right thing for the children now, you are going to not have a nation in the future. We can see from the failed states in Africa now, the children or the young people from those countries are all over the place. Yes. They are not in that country. And what is going to happen to those countries in the future? Either the people will be lost to other countries, or they will come back with different views, and their nationality, their pride of who they are may be lost. And
So we're talking, Hadila, about state failure now, and in a previous conversation between us, you mentioned that you are building up an index, you are building up knowledge about how a government is working and how it's delivering, in part with the goal of strengthening government capacity. Tell me, what does that assume with respect to the role of the citizen?
I think what we felt when we started producing our index was that this would be a tool for citizens to hold governments to account, and I think that that put us in an unnecessary opposition with government. I think there's been a real shift in the decade, just under a decade that we've been working, and more governments, we have this new generation of quite technocratic young leaders starting to come up in some states, and there are governments who are willing to engage with you around data on how to improve their performance. Whereas I think 10, 15 years ago, the assumption maybe was that you had to fight government in order to have that conversation. Now they're approaching us and asking us, how can we improve our score in the index? So,
and the data includes what's the information you track?
Sure. So we measure about 150 variables. Some are clustered, so it's about 120 different things, and they range from safety and security, rule of law, transparency, corruption, rights, public management, health, education. So it's really the full range of public goods and services that citizens have a right to expect from their government. We then do that for, at the moment, 52 countries, as we're not currently able to disaggregate North and South Sudan because the data hasn't been around long enough. And then we do a range of things, from taking out newspaper advertisements, doing radio broadcasts, and just trying to let citizens know how their government is doing relative to their neighbours, and to try and foster a slight sense of competitiveness.
Yeah. Your mention of safety and security brings me back to the previous speaker, and I guess that requires that an individual feels safe within the family, within the community, stepping forward and sort of calling things out. Say something about that.
Yeah. If you think about it, for any business to thrive, there must be stability, at least a conducive environment for business to thrive. And safety and security are key, a key ingredient in ensuring that ecosystem I'm talking about. And unfortunately, what we see is not stability. I mean, Andy now explained, she demonstrated what could happen. And we're talking here about women, and maybe some of us have been exposed to the kind of violence that she is talking about. And it is becoming entrenched in not only South Africa, unfortunately, because we also work in the region. We're finding that violence against women and children is growing, and this is no way to, create a conducive environment for growth. Everybody is now talking about the new scramble for Africa. Everybody is talking about new resources being found in Africa, Africa being the next growth point in terms of the economy. If the environments that we have to operate in are not conducive for that growth, we unfortunately are going to lose again. And if we do not start now and create the space for our young people, first to be skilled, to be trained, in terms of leadership, and to understand how to use these opportunities. Most of us here that are really doing well in our business have been exposed in other countries. Very few of us have been exposed in our own countries of what it does, what it takes to be a good entrepreneur, to be a good leader, to be skilled properly. Why can't us Africans create that environment in our own countries? People have to go outside of their own countries to be what they need to be. And then they come back. Earlier in the discussions that we had, the lady said, I did well in America. I was able to grow. My skills were everything. I come back to Africa, I'm a woman again. I'm something different. There are so many other variables that come to play before I am able to practice the skills I have to do the business that I want to do. That, unfortunately, is what Africa is holding Africa back. We've got what it takes to make Africa become the next growth point in the world. And we've got the numbers to do it. But do we have the skills? Have you seen what the numbers look like in terms of young people? This country, for instance, is the worst in terms of training its young people. We always come up, last in terms of how we prepare our young people for the economy. We've got a whole lot of graduates out there that have got their degrees, but the degrees are useless. The industry cannot use them. They do not have the skills that the country needs to get where it needs to be. Why are we doing that to our children? Yeah. Why can't we really stop and look at what do we need as Africa to get where we need to be for the next generation? Our young people will not be able to be part of the scramble for Africa because we haven't prepared them for that. We are not, in South Africa now, Mama Rafaeli said South Africa has been developed for a long time. I agree with you, but I disagree at the same time. We still have children that are in mud schools that sit 5 in a desk. A meter-long desk sits 5 children. And we expect those young people to be economically ready in 12 years' time to join the mainstream economy. We have children that do not have clean water supply systems in their schools. And if you are a girl, that means you will miss 2 weeks out of every month because there is simply no water or sanitation in the school. And we have young people, I have said, that have to queue and die just to get into a tertiary institution. I could go on forever, but I'm just saying to us, wake up, Africa. Let's look at what we have. Mm-hmm. What have we been exposed to as South Africans that got us where we are now? Why can't we do the same for our children and our young people and ensure that they have the opportunities that we've been talking about this whole morning and they can grab them and run? We are going to lose Africa again. This new scramble for Africa is not going to be for Africans. They will be coming in again to recolonize Africa because what are we doing? We're not preparing ourselves. We're not preparing our children to take, to take Africa into the next level. So I am saying, yes, leaders can be born. Leaders are born. All of us have got the potential to be leaders. What we need is the right exposure, the right preparation, and the right information that will move us to the next level to lead.
I think that Nelson Mandela, I'm not going to quote him exactly because I'm sure to get it wrong, but he in essence said the best test of a society and a society's values is how that society treats its children. He
actually said there is no keener measure of a society's soul than the way it treats its children.
And so as we think about this, I think that most of us think in our own minds that we would, as we set priorities, we would put kids first. We would put children first. As you look around, are we doing that?
No. The sad thing, at least I can talk about my country because I know it better. The sad thing is that we've got all the systems in place. The law, the constitution, the budgets, everything is in place. But it does not translate to the well-being of the child. Where do we lose it? Where do we lose it? Somewhere along the way? Because it's not that there is no money to do it. The money is there, but how are we using it to help our children? We throw textbooks into the river rather than deliver them. We do funny stuff. Mm-hmm. A school collapses from the rain because it's built of mud, and 5 years later, the school is still there with holes. Mm-hmm. And you ask yourself, what is so difficult about putting the school together? Why are we even in a mud school, for God's sake? This is South Africa.
Mm-hmm. You were talking earlier about preparing the next generation for the jobs of the future. Yep. And I'm struck by the fact in yesterday's conversation about education and maternal and child health, we came to the view that, that we're doing quite well when it comes to numbers of children who are in primary school.
Yes.
So now the issue is not so much access, the issue is quality, and the issue
Number
is...
of schools.
And it's also relevance to the jobs of the future. Talk to me about, because leadership is so much a part of what that child will do, either in civil society, as a citizen, as in business or in philanthropy. Talk to me about the modeling that you all do in which kids have to model leadership through a kind of a mock parliament. Say something about the parliament program.
Okay. The youth parliaments that we run are actually a way of us enabling young people to voice their issues, so that those that are in power and authority are able to understand the views from the perspective of the child. Because some of the solutions we put in place are unfortunately designed by people like me. I think this is what young people need, this is what young people are going through, and I design those solutions and then impose them on young people. And we find that that doesn't work. They live in a different space altogether. I come from a generation, three generations back. The new generation is a technology generation, and information generation, and they are in a different environment altogether. So they need to be part of the solution. And the parliaments are supposed to enable them to say, here we are, these are our issues. And therefore, we get the right audiences there for the young people, government, business, civil society, parents, and then we allow children then to voice those issues with the view that we will then be able to take whatever the children are saying and put it in the right platform so that solutions can be found.
Yep. So this is civil society at work, Adil. And so I'm going to take you from South Africa to Northern Africa and ask you about the role civil society played in what has been referred to as the Arab Spring, but also give me a sense of looking forward, will civil society be robust throughout Africa? Where do you see strengths? Where do you see weaknesses? And what can be done to promote civil society?
It's a huge question. I would say that the role of the youth, the role of civil society in the Arab Spring, it really wasn't civil society, it was young people. And it's tragic to see now how those young people who have been completely betrayed by their elders, by the political class, by the Muslim Brotherhood who have captured the state, that those young people died to liberate. And I think the signs are that North Africa is going to be a very, very problematic place for very many years to come, or at least for the short to medium-term future. In terms of civil society more broadly in Africa, I would say that the general trend has been really positive, and civil society has really come out of its box in the last 10 years in a way that it can't really be shut down again. And I think that's been facilitated by mobile phones in particular, and now with 3G and smartphones, I think it becomes much more difficult to control information flows, people's ability to associate, people's ability to understand what their governments are doing. I mean, my parents' generation, you needed permission. When my father was a student, you needed permission to use a photocopier in the university. The government control of information was so acute, and that can never happen again. So I think that's been a really interesting trend. I think the question, it was interesting hearing you talking about mud schools. When the ANC came to power almost 20 years ago now, under the National Reconstruction Development Plan, the money was put aside to ensure that there were no more mud schools. And it wasn't implemented. Now, you can call that corruption, I would call it bad governance, but the money, where did the money go? And that's really where citizens have to come forward and ask the questions of government. What exactly are you doing? And this notion, and people like Mampela Rampela and Jay Naidu in this country talk very eloquently about it, but being a citizen involves a degree of education and engagement that most people are kind of a bit lazy for. How many of you scrutinize your local government budget? How many of you know who your local councillor is? How many of you vote in a local election? So we sit back and complain about this kind of corrupt and inefficient political class, but we're completely unengaged. We're not willing to do the homework, and I think there has to be a sea change in in the level of activism and engagement of individuals if they want to see the right outcomes for their children. But I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can berate the political class and then go home and watch a soap opera. 19.8 years. So we have 500 million Africans under 19.8, 500 million over 19.8. The average age of an African head of state is about 62.1 years. So if you look at the chasm between those two, you know, and I would say I have quite an enlightened father, and the difference is maybe less than that. But we fundamentally disagree on a lot of things. Our perspectives are fundamentally different. So who are these rulers ruling for, and what's their orientation, and what's their understanding of the priorities of these young people? What mechanisms can you create for the young people to be able to input into leadership, for them to be, for example, in Sierra Leone, on every decentralization committee across the country, there have to be young people on those committees at the local government level. So how can we start promoting more models where responsible young people in their late teens, early 20s are in government, are in local government? Because I think the challenge as it stands is, I think you will find more Tunisians. I mean, I think there's a real danger for Africa that if our senior leaders fail to respond to the aspirations, and particularly this unemployment issue, particularly the fact that we're going to have several 100 million Africans entering the labour market in the next 10 years, and where are the jobs? And government is not going to create several 100 million jobs. It's just not possible. So as we have more and more unemployed young people, and statistically speaking, in Africa, as a young person, the more educated you are, the less likely you are to have a job. So, you know, that's a really worrying statistic. You know, if you are an uneducated 18-year-old, you're more likely to be in work than an educated 18-year-old. So this time bomb of demography and unemployment is going to explode. And, you know, and it's going to be accelerated by the fact that with mobile phones and with information, those young people can quickly organize. And you know, our young people today in Africa are so much more aspirational than their parents' generation. They're plugged into MTV. They can see what is out there in the rest of the world, and they want parts of it. So I think we have some interesting times ahead.
It's work, but it's low-paid work. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what we need is new solutions for Africa. And the textbooks must be developed by Africans. We are the ones experiencing what Africa is going through now, and we are the ones that understand what the problem is, so we should come up with the solutions. I strongly believe that, you know, even if you import solutions and try to indigenize them, a big chunk of what works really comes from the ground. Yeah. And we need to make our communities more viable, and that starts with the family. The African family has been so weakened, and it's by a whole lot of factors. Over and above the disease burden, we've got poverty, we've got unemployment, we've got migration, we've got political instability, and that has weakened the African family considerably, and that goes for weakened communities. And until we get that right, we cannot start to build Africa. Africa starts with the family. Where is our family at now? What do our communities look like? Are they functional communities? You know, we always say it takes a village to grow a child. You will have to bear with me. I come from this child background, so I will always look at the world from that perspective. If it takes a community to raise a child, what does that community look like? If it's anything that Andy was describing right now, that child is dead. So we need to think of new solutions for Africa, develop those solutions ourselves. We are the hardest hit region in Africa by HIV and AIDS. Do we write those textbooks ourselves? How do we cope with the effect of HIV on our communities? We are the ones that can come up. We have lived with it since 1984. We should have the solutions ourselves. So we need to develop African solutions for African problems. And it starts with us. And we cannot keep looking out for solutions for people to help us, but do it ourselves.
So speaking of looking out, I think we've got time for probably only 2 questions. And I just want to throw something out there for those, I know neither of you was here when Graça Machel spoke. And what among the wonderful things she said, the powerful things she said, was that we lack the resolve to provide every individual a life of dignity. And so I think sort of the challenge to all of us in this room is the building of that resolve. And we're talking about different aspects of it, but it's the building of that resolve. Do we have questions? We've got a question back there, but do we have a microphone?
Sorry, thank you very much. I'm going to try and do this very quickly. Pedro Pires, who's the recipient of the last Mo Ibrahim Prize, was a prime minister for 16 years under a one-party system before he became president. So I'm just saying that when we look at, I had the good fortune of working with your father when he was conceptualizing the prize. But what I'm saying is that there are layers to every situation, lots and lots of layers. And I think I said that yesterday, that the one message, Madiba, President Mandela, wonderful man, pulled the ANC out of negotiations in 1992. And that was a wrong decision. Everybody said so. And he took Julius Nyerere when he came here to say to him, Madiba, if you do that, these white people have seen your weakest flank. And every time they would go and kill 100 there, 200 there, and you'll never get free. Go back to the negotiation table and get your freedom. And because he stayed in jail for 27 years, others were in exile who succeeded him. They didn't know half the people who were in their cabinet. So, people always sort of pull out the leader alone. And Pedro Pires did that because there were circumstances that led to them not having a multi-party system in Cape Verde. And a very intelligent man. And I love him to bits, and he's our guest this month in the Africa Day speech. But all I'm saying is that, when we talk in a forum like this, we need to just leave people with a sense of context that, Madiba is the first one to say, I wasn't an individual who did all of this. It was within a context. He always says that there was an organization and there was a context. So that's
we're going
really,
to have to move on to the next question.
What we need, I think this is important. Mm-hmm. It's very important, even for Zimbabwe. Young people must be curious to say what really happened. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So, and we have to be willing to celebrate when something's done right. We need to be able to celebrate that as well. We've got two here, and I think that's going to be all the time we're allowed. So,
hi, Connie Jackson. One of the things that I think, we were talking about Brand Africa yesterday, and one of the issues that comes up is around the whole idea of charity. Is people always think of Africa as charity, even though obviously that's changing. And I was hoping that we would talk more about moving from charity to philanthropy, which is empowering and sustainable. Could you talk a little bit about how you move the thought of doing things in Africa from charity to philanthropy?
Absolutely, and let's just take that last question, and we'll answer them both together.
Yeah, this is just to bring back the issue of philanthropy. Just last month, I think January, in Washington, and there was a launch of the Africa Philanthropy Forum. It's covered in this magazine. Mm-hmm. And we also had an interview with Hadil, with her father. It's also covered in this magazine. And Dr. Ibrahim actually mentioned that he doesn't consider himself as a philanthropist. And with the formation of the Africa Philanthropist Forum, how do you see the future of philanthropy in moving the Africa in the next 50 years, for example? Is that where we should be heading to?
Yes. So Hadil and I can both take this because I think when it comes to your father, he's a disruptor, right? So say a word about the role he plays, because he's both a philanthropist and a civil society actor and a business actor.
Right.
But in all three, he's a disruptor.
I think that's right, and I think he's trying to show that these things don't necessarily have to be that you can be consistent. He was a businessman that did clean business, and the values that he has espoused as a businessman, he's taken into philanthropy, he takes into his life as an individual citizen. You know, there's no need to have a disconnect between all of those. But I would just say that philanthropy in of itself isn't particularly accountable, so I'm always a little bit wary of people saying it's going to be the big next new development flow. This is rich people spending their money on what they want, and if they want to spend it on something sensible, fine, and if they want to spend it on something completely crazy, that's what they're going to do. It's their money. So how we consider it to be a developmental flow or not, you know, I may be more pragmatic. But I just very also briefly wanted to respond to the point about Pedro Pires. I mean, Pedro Pires is a remarkable man, and certainly we're always willing to talk about context. He was the leader under a multi-party system, but he went into opposition after being prime minister for many years and had to move back into his mother's house because he couldn't afford a house of his own after a decade or so of being prime minister. So yes, context is important, but you know, there has been a lot of emphasis in the development space over the last few decades that sort of pretends that politics doesn't matter and individuals don't matter and it's about building grassroots. Individuals matter. A bad president can destroy a good country in 5 years. We're being naive to think everything will happen from the grassroots. If some crazy person comes in and sends you to war with this country or dismantles the rule of law, the country is finished, or is finished for a decade or 2 decades. So we have to be honest about the importance of individuals. And it's quite terrifying because it raises all these complicated issues about, you know, do we wait for a Mandela or do we create a Mandela? But individuals matter, and we shouldn't get too caught up in this notion of it's all going to come from the grassroots. We need to identify and understand that having someone at the top of a country that wants to take it forward in a principled way is the biggest single game-changing thing that can happen.
So back to philanthropy. Of course, Adil has rightly pointed out the one flaw, and that is that philanthropy is not accountable the way in which a democratic government would be. But one of the values of building up a community of philanthropists, a learning community of philanthropists, is they hold one another to account. And that's an important thing. So much of yesterday and today has been about Africa seizing and defining its own future. And part of me sort of saying, you know, it's a myth that Africa is not contributing to its own future or defining its own future. You're seeing extraordinary innovation throughout Africa. I mean, extraordinary. We talked about M-Pesa and Ushahidi as though these were just throwaway lines this morning. But these are emblematic of a larger revolution that's going on, of social innovation that is really robust on this continent. It is made possible, it can be made possible by philanthropy. It can be scaled, brought to other societies that will learn from Africa. I am a real believer that the great new sources of innovation will be in this part of the world, and the great transfers of knowledge will be south-south transfers, not north-south transfers. Finally, let me just end by saying the difference between charity and philanthropy for me is that charity is so often about treating the consequences of poverty or another problem. That's right. So, and then of course, to me, philanthropy is about getting at the causes. And what I'm finding is that more and more successful Africans are saying, I want to move from charity to philanthropy. Because as you all know, generosity, giving, neither is new to Africa, right? There's a long history deep into the many cultures that are here. But this desire to move to a more strategic level is occurring on its own, and the African Philanthropy Forum is meant to be a venue for encouraging that and enabling that. So happy to have any philanthropists join. Please join me, though, first in thanking these two remarkable leaders.